this time, two different perspectives, one from PJM Interconnection. That's Jonathon Monken is with us. He is a Senior Director, System Resiliency and Strategic Coordination. And Matthew Wakefield, who's the Director, Information and Communications Technology R&D with EPRI. And we've heard from EPRI a few times at Power Forward. Welcome, Matthew, and Jonathon, welcome as well. Are we starting with you, Jonathon?
Sure, I'm fine with that, Chairman, or we can start with Matt.
However you guys want to do it.
We're flexible.
Christina's driving, so.
Christina, you're in the.
Okay, I guess I'm going first.
Okay, there we go.
Commissioners and Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to come here and present. Perspective actually has been very enjoyable. Particularly the last session is a good example, I think, of three industry thought leaders sharing their perspective and the proactive approach on cybersecurity. So one of my goals here today is to, as a representative of EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, is share some activities around industry collaboration and the deliberate actions being taken to address cybersecurity gaps, manage risks, improve the overall cybersecurity posture of the industry, and to show how a combination of individual utilities are working together to make industry-wide positive contributions to address these cybersecurity gaps. So you probably have seen this before, as EPRI's been here presenting many times. We are an independent, nonprofit, collaborative R&D organization, independent, objective, scientifically based R&D to address issues around the grid. We're a nonprofit chartered for the public benefit, and we're collaborative. So this is, I want to just emphasize collaborative just for a moment. As we heard in the previous presentation, we heard some challenges around getting cybersecurity talent, getting the right expertise. And this is an example where we're working together with literally hundreds of cybersecurity experts to solve common issues. This is very difficult to do as an individual organization. So we've got this intellectual leverage of bringing the best minds in the world together, and then also the financial leverage as we identify common issues, pooling together resources to do the science to address those issues. At a high level, and we heard a little bit about this already, what are some of the industry trends impacting cybersecurity? We have a whole set of issues on generation, transmission, and distribution. The necessary real-time situational awareness to be aware of the state of the grid from an operational perspective, and then also from a cybersecurity perspective. We have the increasing dynamics of supply and demand with balancing DER, which is distributed energy resources, and another acronym. I think you've probably heard a ton of acronyms. I apologize for that. I'll throw a few more out at you here. But DERMS is another one, Distributed Energy Resource Management System. How do we manage these resources on the distribution system? Increasing mobile workforce. There's a lot of benefits around having mobile workers that can do work remotely, having that connectivity, but also making sure they do it in a secure way, in a secure manner. Increase automation and communications. All of this is very dependent on a reliable communication system. Again, benefits around automation, but as we look at doing these types of capabilities to improve the efficiency and reliability of the grid, obviously we need to consider cybersecurity as a key component. On the customer side of things, we're seeing increased amount of self-generation. The primary one that we're seeing globally is solar photovoltaics. So having residences or even commercial facilities have their own generation capability. The promise of energy storage to help balance that, electric vehicles, and we just heard a little bit on the previous session about Internet of Things devices. These are things that the customer may own that impact the operation, the generation and supply of the grid that the utility may have no ability to manage. And then this gets increasing complex as we have third parties, distributed energy resource, demand response aggregators. Who is responsible for cybersecurity when you have non-utilities with the capability to manage and control and operate these resources? And that opportunity to control that is really a benefit to the grid. As we see increasing amount of penetration of these distributed energy resources like solar, that can create challenges. But the smart inverters, you may have heard the term, have a lot of capability to provide voltage support and other capabilities that can add a strong benefit to the grid. Some capabilities can operate autonomously. Some of them require periodic communications. But again, it gets very complex as you have multi-party stakeholders involved. So what is the right cybersecurity architecture to support that? And then we've got the national security and resiliency issues. It seems like we hear daily about malicious attacks. We've got the potential issues of natural catastrophes. So all of these are things to be aware of as looking at impacting cybersecurity risk, particularly on the distribution system, distributed energy resources, multi-party stakeholders, where we're having an increasing amount of connectivity to benefit the grid. We've got to have the right cybersecurity in place. We have a diversity of different types of devices being put on the grid. The pace of change of these devices is rapidly evolving. And the scale in the distribution system is much larger than a transmission system, so you've got the scalability challenges and then the large variety of stakeholders that are involved. So not only do you have the utility, the aggregators, the customers, and so on. This is a bit of an eye chart. You're not intended to read this entire thing, but I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on the orange portion. So the area of research I'm responsible for at EPRI is information, communication, and cybersecurity. So there's a good tie to the presentations that were this morning on data. So a lot of value recognized by the ability to transact data on the grid. So from a variety of situations, from the customer to the distribution, from the transmission, and so on. In order to transact that data, you need a robust communication system. So there's a lot of research going on telecommunications. And then as you're looking at data and communications, you need to have that cybersecurity perspective looking at that. Now, interestingly, on our roadmap here, I have a link to it. We really only go out 3 years in our roadmap because this area is changing so fast. The technologies, the communications, the cybersecurity practices, it's very difficult to have a roadmap that doesn't change drastically if you go more than 3 years out. But there is a lot of value here in looking at this. So this roadmap is not just EPRI's roadmap. This is working with utilities around the world to identify what are the future states. Where do you want to be and what are the issues we need to address? What are the gaps we need to bridge to achieve that future state? And then the action plan to bridge that gap. So I'm going to go a little bit more detail here on the cybersecurity aspect of this. This is still a bit of an eye chart, but not quite as bad as the previous one. You can see on the future states, we have 3 areas. IT, OT, security convergence. So this is at a high level, taking IT technologies and applying them for the operations of the grid. IT technologies are fairly mature, but they haven't for a long time been applied for grid operations. And the needs from a reliability perspective are different than traditional IT systems, where you really are striving for 100% reliability. And so looking at a number of issues around IT, OT, security, convergence. The next one is around business processes, and we heard a little bit about NERC-CIP and risk management, a whole host of activities around the challenges associated with business processes for cybersecurity. And then the third one, which is what I was just talking about around cybersecurity for distributed energy resources and integration in a multi-party stakeholder environment. 2 years ago, this wasn't even on our roadmap. I mean, this is just an example of how fast things are changing. We're doing projects internationally that are dealing with this right now, where there's mandated communications to solar PV, for example, in Japan. And there's a new IEEE standard, IEEE 1547 update to the standard, which is an interconnection guideline, which just late last year for the first time now has a communication and cybersecurity component to it. So identifying that need for connectivity and cybersecurity. So what I'm going to do is just at a high level, the cybersecurity program that we do, the purpose of it, we're focused on mitigating risks, dealing with legacy systems, because how do we preserve those systems, have security practices while adopting the next generation of grid systems, improve security with advanced network and threat management technology, effectively evaluated security program processes. A big part of our work is collaboration, so learning from our peers, and then leveraging EPRI's expertise and our ability to collaborate with the industry. I'm in our Knoxville, Tennessee office. That's where our cybersecurity lab is, so we have an opportunity to leverage that resource for the industry. Two areas, just as examples, I'm going to talk about are one on threat management, and tell a little bit of a story on where we've been and where we're going, on how we are managing and working on threat detection. And the second one is on cybersecurity metrics for the electric sector. So with that, I'm going to go into this first example. So I believe it was Stan who'd mentioned the Metcalfe Substation shooting. Have you all heard of this? Well, bear with me. I'm just going to, just for the purpose of the presentation, I'll go through this at a high level. So again, nearly 5 years ago, I can't believe it's been that long, there was a shooting at PG&E's Metcalfe Substation. The actual shooting event occurred for 19 minutes. The first activity that occurred where telephone cables were cut. The shooters took out 17 large transformers. It forced the utility to reroute power to avoid a major outage. And the police arrived 1 minute after the shooters disappeared. 27 days for that repair to take place. So this is a pretty significant event. What I'm going to expand on this story is, so from a research perspective, what's the challenge and what is the opportunity in this scenario and where we've been. So looking at this from a timing and threat detection. So at 12:58 in the morning, an AT&T fiber optic telecommunication was cut. 107, another internet service provider level 3's communications network was cut. So this was detected by the communication systems that there was a network outage. Shortly thereafter, at 1:31, a surveillance camera at the substation that was recorded and reviewed later saw that there was a flashlight, and they think that was a signal for the shooters to start firing, then followed by a muzzle flash of rifles and sparks bullets hitting the fence. So that was detected by the physical security systems. At 1:37, there was an alarm from motion sensors, I think from the bullets rattling off the fence. 1:41, the Sheriff's Department received a 911 call about gunfire. And at 1:45, there was a alarm at the control center letting them know that the transformers have overheated as a result of the transformers being riddled with bullet holes. 1:51, police officers arrived. A minute before that, the shooting had stopped and the attackers had left. The police, unable to get past the locked fence, seeing nothing suspicious, they left. 3:15 a.m., the PG&E worker arrived to survey the damage. Now, so when we look at this situation and we look at what happened in retrospect, Monday morning quarterback, you can see there's a series of events, a number of different systems detected various activities. How quickly were they to correlate these events to identify hey, this is a pretty significant physical attack. In that type of event, who do you send when you've got a telecom issue? Maintenance. Who do you send when you've got a transformer issue? Maintenance. PG&E, an hour and a half later, sent their worker out to survey the damage. That's not the type of person you probably want to send out to a situation like this where you're having an attack. So looking at one of the projects that we actually had started in 2013, and we're able to use this use case in a formulation of an overall framework called the Integration Security Operations Center. So utilities and many organizations have a number of different event and aggregation tools and resources to monitor activities around their various systems. They have IT security events looking at the network, the IT system logs. OT, which is operational security events based on control centers, substation gateways, field devices. You have grid operational events. So this would be things like the transformer alarms or even breaker operations. Field network operations could be telecom, physical security, and then there's some new technologies that are being applied, behavioral learning appliances, industrial security appliances. So this ISOC framework architecture is an approach to aggregate inputs from these disparate systems that have typically been siloed and collect them all in a single location and then do some event correlation. What are various scenarios you expect multiple events to occur? So for example, if you have a worker go to a substation and they badge in, is that person on a work order, is he expected to be there? You may have a camera which has facial recognition. Does that face align with the badge? Is the computer, when their computer is plugged in, is their computer authorized to plug into that device? That's kind of a detailed use case, but some of the examples of what is put in here that combines physical information, IT and OT type information, all gets correlated. And then also with external information. The previous presenters talked about the number of external notifications and sources of information about vulnerabilities and threats, correlating that all together and reporting that out into their Security Information Event Management System, or SIEM. So this is a good story, I think, that shows how multiple utilities have been very active in identifying challenges and working together to make an international contribution towards an overall framework that benefits the entire industry. I will say, just as an example of leadership in Ohio, Bennett Gaines, the CIO of First Energy, championed this project in 2013 and rallied together executives around the country to help sponsor this project and collaborate on this R&D to make this possible. It actually is having an international impact. We are having, we're seeing other utilities not necessarily involved in EPRI adopt this methodology, but for example, we're going to Japan next month and implementing this for a Japanese utility, where they're starting to look at best practices around the world. Part of our mission at EPRI is public benefit, and many of these deliverables on, and you can see kind of the staging of the activities that we've done, in addition to one-on-one engagements with utilities, are publicly available at no cost. Some of them do have a fee, but usually eventually all of them get publicly available at no cost as long as there's no sensitive information. We want utilities to deploy these approaches and technologies, and we also want their feedback. We learn from utilities collaboratively around the world. So that's one example of a project that is started, industry leadership got together, addressed the issue, and it continues to this day. So another project, just to shift gears a little bit, is on cybersecurity metrics. Research question, is there a way to standardize security metrics that will result in industry-wide impacts? I'll say most utilities, and we heard already today, that they have a cybersecurity metrics in place already. And what are metrics? Metrics are data, numbers that represent the effectiveness of your cybersecurity program. There's a lot of value if the industry adopts a common practice to help learn from each other on how to collect that data, how to automate that data, learn best practices from others, and take that to the next level. So this is relative, I'd say it's probably mid-project wise. We've been working on this a couple years, and we still have several years to go. But where this fits in, I think we've heard from the previous presenters on some examples of cybersecurity requirements. We heard about NERC SIP requirements, mandatory for the bulk electric system, but discretionary for distribution, but a lot of application and distribution. An overall framework, the Nist cybersecurity framework is a great framework that many utilities apply for that overall guidance for their cybersecurity programs. The C2M2 is an acronym for Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model. This measures the maturity of a cybersecurity program, so utilities can do this assessment, see where they aspire to be in the future, and make take actions to achieve their aspirations. But there is a gap in industry-wide unified approach to cybersecurity metrics, measuring the effectiveness of these of their cybersecurity programs. So why are cybersecurity metrics important? Why are they needed? Well, one, at the low level, from a security team, find out what works and what does not work, and trend it over time to help communicate the security posture, the threats and the risks. For them, they want to demonstrate the value of their work. They want to show that the work that they're doing is valuable to their organization. From a management perspective, helps them make sound decisions on what technologies to deploy, resource allocations, trend effectiveness of those security controls over time. If a utility implements stronger passwords, how do you measure that effectiveness? Is that improving their security? If they invest in new technology, does that improve the effectiveness of their security program? Senior management and the board help them understand cybersecurity risk and make strategic decisions on risk management. And then to have the information that they need to know to inform stakeholders. Is their data secure? Is the grid secure? This is not intended to be made publicly available. It's a tool for them internally. But if we have an industry common resource and methodology, there's great value in that commonality across the industry. And this is actually one where we think there is opportunity to apply this to multiple critical infrastructures. And so we're going to be looking at exploring, is there a broader collaboration opportunity outside the electric industry? So at a high level, it rolls up to 3 strategic metrics: a protection score, a detection score, and a response score. How effective is your cybersecurity program at protecting the grid? How effective is it at detecting attacks? How effective are you at responding to those attacks? And then it rolls down at various levels. It starts off with 120 data points. Right now, the research that we're doing, are these the right data points? Do these truly measure the effectiveness of your program? Can we automate the data collection of this to make it easy? And then those roll up and get calculated into operational metrics and then tactical metrics. We did the first set of demonstrations with 7 utilities last year, and we are working at improvements to the process. We're developing an open source tool that enables utilities to calculate their metrics and make this process easier. So that's a high-level example. And another example of our public benefit mission. All these deliverables are publicly available, no charge. We see great value in the industry adopting these metrics and learning from each other. We're tentatively intend to host industry-wide workshops on the East Coast and West Coast to raise awareness, get feedback on the approach we've taken so far, see what improvements we need to make, but also distribute our open source software so they're aware of it and can begin using it. And again, this is, we think, not only relevant to the electric sector, but other critical infrastructure, so we'll be looking input from those as well. So that's just a quick overview of some of the research we're doing in cybersecurity, trying to bridge the gaps and making progress on those. I hope you find those examples useful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, not just for the invitation to be here, but more importantly for actually hosting these events. It's this type of engagement that I think is really important and productive in making sure that we're kind of level setting what's happening across the industry. The worst thing you can do is not socialize these types of best practices and then find yourself in a situation where everyone is doing something differently, and that makes it even harder for us to really unify the effort to protect the grid, which is really our core responsibility. So I do appreciate the opportunity. I intend to cover the following 90 slides in about 2 hours, so I certainly appreciate your time. And I will be brief because I really want to focus the time and attention on your questions to make sure that we're prioritizing the information being shared today based on what you're most interested in. But from PJM's perspective, just wanted to give you a organizational approach in terms of how we tackle this. PJM, if you're not aware, we're the world's largest grid operator. We cover about 20% of the U.S. population, including the Buckeye State. And amongst those 13 states and the District of Columbia, we have a wide variety of member companies that are there, whether it's the generation asset owners or independent power producers to large investor-owned utilities like we've heard from today. It really runs the gamut. So we do have a good position of visibility of trying to get an idea of what's happening out there. What's interesting about us organizationally is that we don't really own much of any physical infrastructure on the system. We have a very, very small physical footprint. We don't own the transmission lines. We don't own the generators. We don't own any of the substations. But what we do have is the data linkages to remote operate all of those systems. And that's why cybersecurity is of paramount importance to us organizationally. So that's what I intend to talk about a little bit today. So in terms of the threat environment, this is certainly a popular topic in the media right now, and I'm here to spoil a surprise for you. It's not going to go away. It's going to continue to be a topic of hot conversation. So in terms of the threat environment as we see it from an industry perspective, we're really looking at three types of threat actors out there that are touching our systems in some way, shape, or form. The first is nation-state threats, and that was the most recent media engagement or in, stories that we've seen is nation-state actors like Russia, China, North Korea. There are certainly a few of them out there. Unattributable threat actors. These are folks that are really cyber criminals in nature. We're not really sure exactly what their intent is, but typically it's motivated by financial gain. That's what they're going for. So that's certainly something that you see and is really ubiquitous across all industries. It's not limited to critical infrastructure. It touches everybody. Cyber criminals are really more often than not interested in exactly who they're attacking. They're just interested in whether or not they can make a buck off of it or a Bitcoin, depending on what they're looking for. The last category is insider threats. So these are all the folks that are working at our utility companies, and really the biggest risk from the insider threat standpoint is no matter how good your firewall is, no matter how good your protective systems are, they already have permission to be there. So that's one of the biggest challenges is that a lot of the typical hurdles that we put in place, the protective systems that we have in place, can really be circumvented by folks that have authorized access to the system. So in terms of how we rack and stack each of these threat groups, each one creates a unique risk profile. So insider threats, as I mentioned before, has the greatest ability to circumvent the protective systems that we have in place because of their authorized access, and it stands to reason that they have the best knowledge of our systems, having operated them and having taken part in some instances, either the construction or operation of some of those systems. They have a really good working knowledge of it. Unattributable threat actors, interestingly enough, is what we see with the greatest volume. So this is really everything that they're trying to accomplish from a financial gain standpoint is a volume game. It stands to reason that it's not unlikely to assume that them touching our system is an accident. It was really just about finding a vulnerability that they were scanning for at large, and the fact that they found a vulnerability in a utility company may just be a coincidence. It's just another one of the systems that they're trying to break into for some type of financial gain. So that's where we see the greatest degree of volume. In terms of the overall threat, we don't necessarily assess that to be as high as insider threats, or the last category being nation-state threats as being the highest overall potential impact on the system. And that's ultimately because nation-state threats have the greatest amount of resources at their disposal. They have the financing, they have the technical expertise, and most importantly, they have the time or the political motivation to be able to map these types of systems and try and generate these types of effects. But overall, that's what we envision as the cyber threat environment for the utility industry today. So what do we do to manage some of these threats? It's all about risk management, recognizing that you don't have enough money, time, personnel, or anything else to try and address every single risk everywhere. So how do we prioritize it? What's the most important thing? What types of protective systems really bring us the greatest value? So we break it into 5 elements. So there's the risk management that I really discussed there in terms of the threat environment. What's a higher risk for us? What's a lower risk? And what are the threat vectors that are most relevant to us? The second area is how do we defend against it? And I'll talk about a couple of industry practices that are out there right now. The next one is response. So the saying goes there are 2 types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that don't know it yet. So the question is not if, but when it happens, and what are you doing from a response standpoint? And that's, I think, a very important part of this overall picture of recognizing that you can have the best firewall in the world, but you need to make sure that you have response protocols, practices, and capabilities that are going to be effective. Education is certainly a big one, recognizing that we're only as strong as the weakest link in the very literal context here. So anybody that's uneducated about the cybersecurity risk overall is just raising their profile as a threat to the system, recognizing that there's many, many points of entry, and often education is the best way to defend against it. In other words, just don't click that link. Please don't click the link. That's what we're shooting for. The last area is partnership, which is we definitely can't do this alone. There's no circumstance in which an individual utility company is going to be capable of taking on a nation-state actor. That's just a totally unrealistic expectation. And what that means is you need friends in this fight, and we really recognize not only the value of partnership, but it needs to be proactive in nature. Friends aren't just going to pop up out of the woodwork. It's something that we need to proactively pursue, and then also try and identify the types of skill sets and capabilities that are most needed from an industry perspective. So, as promised, I'll talk a little bit about some of the defensive practices, and my purpose in doing so is not just from an educational standpoint of talking about it, but recognizing that from the regulatory perspective, defensive practices are the types of things that fall within the regulatory wheelhouse. What are we doing to create that minimum bar to clear? You must be this tall to ride this ride to make sure that people are adequately protecting their systems. So a couple of examples that I'll highlight here. Vulnerability management is something that all organizations struggle with, and this is as simple as the types of patching, the frequency of patching, and the types of patching that you're doing with all of your IT systems. So it sounds very basic. Every time you get that little update icon on your smart device that you're carrying around with you in your pocket, you always wonder, is now a good time to do it? I guess I should probably wait. Oh, it looks like I have 12 of them, and slowly but surely you come around to the point where you're just going to have to sit down and connect and do the update. The same thing happens when you're looking at organizations and what they have to do, because patching sounds like a very easy thing to do, but it tends to be very complex. So being able to update something that touches so many different elements of your IT system means that it carries more probability for creating just not cyber-related threats per se, but just operational inefficiencies or operational challenges as you're trying to do these software updates. But I can't highlight enough the importance of maintaining a proactive vulnerability management program. It's a great way to stay on top of it as much as possible. Impact analysis, of trying to understand what's the most important thing within your system. So recognizing that we love all of our children equally in this environment, you have to pick favorites, and you have to figure out what part of your IT or OT systems are most critical to the maintaining the reliable operation of those systems. So how are you assessing the relative impact of the loss of individual IT applications or OT applications that your system relies on? And knowing which one is most important is really involves or informs the decision process of what types of protective systems you're putting on each one of those. Recognizing that it would be great to have the highest level, most expensive, most sophisticated protective systems on all of them, that's not always realistic in terms of an approach. Technology lifecycle is an ongoing process. People are constantly updating. If you have a laptop that's 2 years old, it's old. That means you need to get a new one, and every time you're updating all these systems, the question is, what are you doing to make sure that as you're doing it with a security-minded approach? This is also tied to supply chain management. This is one of the biggest topics, and I'll talk about it at the end, but it's certainly something that's raising the profile, is trying to understand the entirety of the supply chain from a single laptop at an organization is a very complicated process. Knowing from a software and hardware perspective who manufactured or designed all of those systems that are ultimately stitched together into one single device, but ultimately have a point of origin in potentially dozens, if not hundreds of different locations, trying to understand how those things can be affected and changed to harm your system is a very, very important thing to do. And it's arguably the most difficult thing for us to do because we just don't have visibility into the entirety of the supply chain. Predictive analytics is really the best way that we can identify insider threats. So we're constantly monitoring what all of our employees are doing on all of their work-related devices, and use a lot of behavioral analytics to determine who's doing things that are more consistent with somebody that's a more probable insider threat. So they're trying to gain access to areas of the system that they're not supposed to. They're using applications that are not directly related to their work, and behaviors like that. Data management is certainly a big one. So trying to understand, we collect a lot of data. The real question is why? So is there data that you're currently collecting that's no longer necessary? I'll take it from the retail perspective as an example. It raises a lot of questions about how much data you have on individual customers. Do you have social security numbers? Do you have their mother's maiden name? Do you have the name of their favorite pet? If you have all of that type of information, those are potentially keys to unlock more than just what's going on with their utility bill. And the question is, how long do you need to retain that information, and what information is most important to maintain in order to identify an individual customer for the purpose of billing? So doing a proactive review of the data that you have, and why you have it, and what you're doing with it, is something that is not only just good business practice, but carries the potential to reduce your vulnerability or desirability as a target. The more data you have, the more likely it is that people want it. The last thing that I'll highlight is, I think, a common thread through all the presentations that you've heard today about cybersecurity is information sharing. So more often than not, I'd like to reference the bumper sticker that says, it may be that your life only serves as a warning to others. So recognizing that if you experience some type of vulnerability in your system or some type of attack, it stands to reason that there are other people who share that vulnerability, but it just hasn't been exposed yet. And the worst thing that you can do is keep all of that to yourself and tell no one, because all you're doing is you're opening up other people to those types of attacks. And there are a lot of information sharing mechanisms out there that have already been highlighted, so I won't belabor that point. But suffice to say, the functionality of things like the EISAC are hugely relevant to what we're doing. And being able to make sure that that type of connectivity and that type of information sharing is not just happening within the industry, but with our state and federal government partners as well. Cyber kill chain. You've already seen a cyber kill chain slide, so I will not go through this in exhaustive detail. Suffice to say, one of the most important things about identifying the kill chain is this establishes a common vernacular, a common dialogue that we can get into both from an industry perspective and with government, of understanding what is the relative severity of attacks, what are we doing to establish kind of these tear lines within and throughout the process of trying to identify and remediate these types of cyber risks. So I think what I'll take out of this slide, without going into the details of each stage of the cyber kill chain, is that having a common framework of approach is something that goes a long ways to making sure that we are more interoperable and we can support one another in a cybersecurity environment. On the response side, as I mentioned before, it's not uncommon to see the vast majority of cybersecurity related resources being dedicated to the front end, to that big wall, making sure that you have an effective monitoring program, that you have a good firewall, that you have doing all those other defensive practices that I'd mentioned before. Response gets a little bit trickier. There's not a lot of base of practice out there. If you have a lot of practice with it, that's generally a bad sign. That means you've had a lot of intrusions and you've developed a lot of skills and capabilities around response. What I would encourage is making sure that the more we can establish response protocols in a common framework, I think the more effective that will be. Also, that means that if you're coordinating with the entities that are on this slide, meaning that there are government sources out there, industry sources, commercial sources, and it's all driven by this concept of situational awareness that Matt covered very effectively earlier, you can't build all the capabilities that you need within one organization. It's totally unreasonable to assume that you can do that. What is important is knowing what types of organizations are potentially out there that can leverage those types of unique capabilities. It should come as a surprise to no one that the Department of Defense is the most well-versed on nation-state actors when it comes to cybersecurity. Those are the folks that they're playing chess with on a daily basis. For the utility industry, that's not who we're interacting with on a daily basis. And being able to share that type of knowledge in advance of an event, and more specifically during the response to an event, is something that drives significant value across the board, recognizing that if we can work it collectively and identify the right resource at the right time to be able to remediate these types of issues, the more effective we'll be. State partnerships are no less important. PJM has several state partnerships with National Guard cyber protection teams and other government entities that can support us in these types of environments. You're much more effective if you can develop that relationship in advance of said event. As I like to say, if you need a friend, it's too late to make one. So if you can do that in advance, I think it's a much more effective process. And then there are some new industry sources that are out there. I'll specifically point to cyber mutual assistance, which I know was referenced earlier today. And this is really developing that capability for us to support one another. So that happens on a regular basis in a physical environment. So if you have a storm that rolls through Ohio, you'll quickly see mutual assistance kicking in from utilities that are outside the area of impact but have resources to share, whether it's bucket trucks or linemen or anything else that you can do to support it. The real purpose behind cyber mutual assistance is to take a similar methodology of approach and just apply it to a different type of resource, in this case being cyber. So each one of these types of capabilities has strengths and weaknesses. If you look at cyber mutual assistance, the biggest challenge with cyber is it is not geographically constrained. If you see the track of a hurricane, you know it's not going to hit you, then you're more willing to provide resources to be able to support the utilities that are in the path of that storm. When it comes to cybersecurity, it's much more difficult to try and understand how far or what extent of impact you would expect to experience in a cyber environment, so you're more apt to hold on to those resources. That's why I think that's one of the strengths of government. Government is uniquely positioned to be able to build a capability that really can't exist in the private sector in a lot of different ways, because it's not something that's profit driven, it's not something that's always financially viable for the private industry, but is a unique capability that you're going to want on a cyber rainy day. From the education side of things, this is, as I mentioned, I think is a very, very important way to be able to establish the type of baseline that we're looking for within cybersecurity. So whether you're talking about education of employees within a utility organization on things that we call basic cyber hygiene, just the fundamentals of blocking and tackling and what you should or shouldn't do related to cyber, that's very important. Being able to have proactive engagement through exercises is a very, very big thing to do. There are a lot of exercises that typically happen within silos. It'll happen within government. It'll happen within a particular department or agency. It'll happen at one particular company. The more we can stimulate the opportunities to really expand that scope and make sure that we're playing in the sandbox in advance of an event as much as possible is something that is a significant value add and really raises the overall education of what we're doing and understanding better what government is looking to accomplish and vice versa. So those things are very important. And the last thing I'll mention is forums like the one that we're involved in right now. These types of discussions are the types of stimulants that we need to be able to drive some of the dialogue going forward, making sure that we are identifying gaps that we have in our system that government can potentially fill and vice versa. So the last one, a couple of examples of cybersecurity partnerships out there. The ISAC was already mentioned. The ESCC, the Electric Subsector Coordinating Council, was really the point of origin for that cyber mutual assistance capability that I had mentioned earlier. The Department of Energy does have some well-developed cyber intelligence programs that can assist the industry in trying to gain a better understanding of the threat environment that's out there, give you better insight into the types of threats that you should be mitigating your system against. And then I mentioned the National Guard as an example of the types of response capabilities that are potentially out there that can be leveraged by utility companies. Last thing, where's this road taking us? So something that was referenced earlier, but I really want to focus on is machine speed information sharing. So cyber is such a dynamic environment and is so fast moving, to assume that we would be able to handle this person to person or with phone calls, I think is something that grossly underestimates the speed at which these types of vulnerabilities are exposed in our systems, or the speed at which some of these attacks take place. So being able to establish that type of information sharing at machine speed is a really, really big part of what we need to do. That's not an easy thing to do. There are certainly, if you find, I'm sure you can find a vendor that'll tell them that they have this one solved for you. But what I'd say is really taking that integrated approach of what it looks like from a multi-industry perspective is something that's going to be inherently valuable in this particular space. Larger attack surface area is just a way to say that there are more things that are being connected to the system. So we talk about grid modernization, which I think is quite honestly an industry imperative. Just from a reliability and efficiency standpoint, it's something that's going to come no matter what. So the question is, what are we doing at the front end to ensure that grid modernization is being done in a way that's very thoughtful to the approach for cybersecurity? So that's something that it's just like anything else. It's a lot easier to set the parameters going forward and install the necessary security protocols or procedures or systems that you need at the front end than it is to retroactively go and try and update that system later. Much easier to do it on the front end. And that includes things like the Internet of Things devices. That was a topic that was raised earlier and Matt also identified. So whether you're talking about electric vehicles or you're talking about the remote connectivity of more elements of our system, all of those things just need to be done with a thoughtful approach towards cybersecurity. Distributed energy resources is another great example of that. It comes with a lot of operational benefits, and we shouldn't sacrifice those operational benefits solely in the name of security. What we should do is make sure that we address the security issues at the front end as much as possible. And the last one is evolving threat actors. The threat environment is changing on a day-to-day basis, and that's probably too long of a unit of time to really accurately describe how quickly these things are changing. And as we've seen in the recent trend of malware attacks that we've seen just in the last 18 months, they promulgated through international systems at a speed that had never been seen previously. And that in and of itself should be a significant warning to everybody that's involved in the cybersecurity business, is the speed of onset for these types of vulnerabilities being exposed and these attacks moving through international systems is something that really demands our respect when we're talking about how we're protecting our systems against them. That's all I have. So at this point, I think we'd like to take your questions.
Who'd like to start? Larry?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Just open it up to either one of you, actually. As I was listening to you, Jonathan, at the end of your presentation. It is. Sorry, I remembered to turn it on. I just forgot to point it in my direction. It's late. Jonathan, I was listening and something came to mind toward the tail end of your presentation, and that's this. As we talk about DERs, each point of interconnection with the grid poses a cyber risk, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Is it possible, or is there any wisdom into flowing the data one directionally from the grid to the DERs, or from the DERs through an intermediate monitoring device into a data warehouse, so that you are actually consolidating all of the data from the various sources of those touch points? And would that mitigate or militate against the risk of or enhance the cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think the comparison that I'll draw is the trend 15 years ago is you wanted a really flat IT infrastructure, right? I wanted to be able to touch everything and see everything, and it's much easier. Now it's kind of like the exact opposite of the trend of home buyers out there that want that open floor plan. Our focus is on network segmentation, of creating as many walls, as many doors with as many locks as possible so that it's very difficult to move through the system. And I think that's very similar to the comment that you're making right now, is if we're creating more of those waypoints that can be monitored so that we have greater visibility into the data traffic that's going to and from those types of devices that are being connected to the system. Anytime you can create a choke point from a data perspective, it sounds counterintuitive from an efficiency standpoint, but ultimately the technology available allows us to do it in such a manner that we can maximize the security benefits associated with creating those opportunities where we're monitoring the traffic and then implementing additional protections so that if that element or area of the system is compromised, now you're inside of a much smaller room. Instead of having that open floor plan where you can see so much more, all you can do is bounce around a much smaller system in the grid and have a much smaller potential impact on the system. So I think that's one way to approach it. I think that's not totally dissimilar from the cloud-based strategy of saying, where is all this data being stored and how is it being monitored while it's in there, and then what are those points of entry and exit look like, and how are those being monitored? So I think that's a good way to envision it, and I think it's certainly something that, when leveraged properly, can really bring us some security benefits. Matt?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, and primarily because it's beyond just the data. It's control. And one of the goals is to control the distributed energy resources. Just as an example, in Japan, they've had so much growth in solar PV. In 2015, they enacted what they call the 360 rule, and this means every renewable device on the grid, from residential, commercial on up, has to have the capability to curtail 50% of its capacity on an hour-by-hour basis up to 360 hours per year if it affects grid stability. So that means you have to be able to communicate with those devices. So and your goal is curtail. So you're actually impacting the amount of generation on the grid. So the strategies, this is very complex, and we need to implement strategies like this. But because we're talking about control, we have to be very, very thoughtful about how we do that.
Thank you.
On the third slide, Matt, that you presented, you had a very engaging picture for me. You have the bulk electric system on the left side, and it's connected to the local distribution system on the right side, and you've depicted all the different things that are now being connected, both on the bulk electric system side, new types of generation, then on the distribution side, all these distributed energy resources that are being connected. And so obviously you're thinking about at EPRI about all these different connections that are arising during this period of modernization, including distribution grid modernization. On the PJM side, Jonathan, your charge, as I understand it, is in the first instance been, and since the outset has been, the transmission grid on the bulk electrics that supports the bulk electric system and all the wholesale transactions that occur there, and hasn't been focused on the distribution side. But I assume that you are becoming or have become more interested. Here you are today talking to us, so you are clearly interested in what's going on in the context of grid modernization. To what extent, Matt and Jonathan, do you to what extent are you interested in this, and what concerns do the things that we are considering here in Ohio, to what extent do those things concern you? Is it really a significant part of the concern you face, and how is it of concern to you, and where do you see PJM going in the future as far as its direct interest in what's happening here at the state level?
You want me to go first?
Okay, sure.
Okay, great. We do have a very proactive interest, and I think because of the changing nature of the grid, because of the growing interconnected nature of it, if you look at the system 20 years ago when our wholesale market was put in place, really a lot of the generation that was being utilized was being generated locally. So whatever was powering your lights in your building right now, odds are it was not coming from a terribly long distance. Whereas now, in an economic model, the whole point of the wholesale energy market is to find the lowest cost, most efficient megawatt hour I can find, and it might be from 4 states away. And what we're seeing now is, if you're talking about the use of microgrid technology or the development of microgrids or the distributed energy resources, it's changing a lot of the behavioral models of the grid. So whether it's how we forecast load or how we do efficient dispatch of the generation assets that we have on the system, those are now, they are more susceptible to really the distribution scale behaviors on the system. So for us, the most important thing is recognizing that we want to better understand the behavioral models of what these modern grids look like. So making sure that we have an understanding of how they're going to behave in certain environments so that we can account for that, or have greater visibility into the dispatchability of those types of resources. So Matt had referenced earlier, if you talk about aggregating these distributed energy resources, Japan certainly saw that as a model of understanding that, well, if it doesn't behave the way everything else does in my system, it's just a hole in demand that's increasingly difficult to predict. And that in and of itself creates more opportunities for not only inefficiency, but ultimately unreliable operation of the grid it raises it to an uncertainty level that we're not comfortable with. And that's why we want to be proactive in the development of some of these practices going forward to make sure that there is interoperability between the models that are being utilized at the distribution scale and what's being done at really the RTO or transmission scale. So it's certainly something of primary interest, not to mention the fact that the behavior of, even on the demand side, of the highest demand devices in any individual home are becoming smart devices. So your refrigerators, your air conditioners, through smart thermostats and those types of systems, those are the highest energy demand devices inside an individual home, and they're being increasingly connected to the system in different ways that potentially open the door to cybersecurity risk that should be accounted for, so that we can have better awareness of what the expected behavior is as compared to what's happening right now, and how we can recognize the difference between the two.
Definitely agree with Jonathan's comments. I just want to convey that it's going to happen. All right, these devices are going to get connected. We are seeing this around the world. We've seen it in Germany, and they had so much renewables on the grid, and they identified the need to now communicate to those to manage and control them. It was a very long time and a very expensive process to go back and retrofit every inverter in Germany. Let me just tell you. So you got to be thinking about this ahead of time. Japan is an example where they're looking at it. So as you're thinking about this in Ohio, wherever you're at, as was mentioned in the previous panel, think about cybersecurity on the front end. Even though today you may not connect to it, you may need to connect with it in the future, and you probably will need to connect with it in the future. So having that perspective and the comments around in the previous session about get the security group involved up front. I'll be honest with you, it's a little frustrating sometimes when I see a utility deploy a thermostat or demand response project pilot, and their goal is to manage resources. And when we ask, so what about your communication architecture, your cybersecurity approach, and we'll deal with that when we go through full deployment. Well, that's too late. I mean, you have a great learning opportunity during those pilots to think about that. So, like I said, it's going to happen. We've got some significant research projects to look at what is that ICT, the information communication, and cybersecurity architecture for this DER integration, because it is complex and there's a number of variables and every scenario isn't the same. Everybody may not have aggregators and so on. So let's leave it at that.
So is the place where this proactive effort takes place, is it through the state's interconnection procedures for these distributed resources? Is that where you would see that?
There's some of that, like California is a good example where they're looking at some of their rulemaking. In our efforts, we're working in collaboratively working with utilities around the world and the vendors that are deploying these technologies to understand the utility requirements and then informing the vendors and get the vendors engaged to see what's practical and what's reality. So we don't get too engaged with some of the state efforts unless we're invited to. We are pretty active in some of the California efforts, some of the New York efforts. We'd love to contribute here in Ohio if we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I mean, one of the things that we get, one of the problems of being a regulator is that I don't know how much skill it takes to make this change every 3 years and keep spending and but hopefully keep our utilities safe and our customers safe. So I don't know whether I think maybe you were talking about prioritizing or I don't know what you have to say about that as far as you dealing with different utilities and as we do.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on related to the cybersecurity metrics. I think that's a really powerful platform because it will help utilities prioritize on what they're doing well. If they know they're doing have a very good, say, for example, threat detection score, then they probably have a sound policy and technologies in place to manage that. But if they say, for example, maybe their response score isn't where they want it to be, they may be able to reach out to some of their peer utilities and have a conversation with them with what they're willing to share, and see if they find a utility that is doing very well and very effective and learn from them and help in the prioritization in those investments. When they make those investments, not only you're scrutinizing them, everybody along the decision chain within the utility is asking, why do you need this? How can you justify this investment? And having a common practice and common terminology like the kill chain is very powerful in telling the story and tracking that over time to say, hey, we made this investment, here's what happened, and to the extent that they're comfortable sharing internally within their organization and other stakeholders, there's a lot of learning and very powerful. For EPRI, there's an opportunity, selfishly, we would like them to share, they don't have to, identify what are the gaps and weaknesses that might prioritize our research that we do on their behalf to help bridge some of those gaps. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think that's an example of a tool that can be very powerful. We have, a few more years of work probably to get that to full maturity, but maybe an example of that.
I think it speaks to the challenge of being able to communicate cyber risk mitigation to a ratepayer, of being able to say, if you're talking about making investments and saying, hey, we're going to put this smart meter on your house, good news, that lowers our overall cost, then it helps you out with your rate, or we're going to make this physical improvement to the system, and what that means is your reliability rate's going to go up, you're not going to lose power as frequently or for as long. When you're talking about cybersecurity specifically, it's enormously complicated to be able to say, well, if we invest $10, it gets us this far. If we invest $20, it gets us this far. And I think it speaks to that prioritization. So being able to identify what it is, when I talked about kind of that defensive matrix of the types of things that you can be doing. So everything from, patch management to the impact analysis to understanding how you do data management and that kind of stuff. Those types of things can really lead you down that type of path of saying, okay, well, we know that if we're not doing these fundamentals well, having the fancy cybersecurity ops center is not really gaining a whole lot of benefit for us. It just means that we're detecting all of these attacks that are circumventing a poorly designed defensive system. So I think being able to try and drive that home of saying, well, there are really these fundamentals that need to be done at any company, at any level within, the utility industry. Trying to identify those types of things is a better way to really advise some of the investments that are being made. And there will be a level of sophistication that's appropriate based on the size or footprint or scope of an individual organization. You heard from 2 large investor-owned utilities that absolutely need the sophisticated cybersecurity programs that they have. They have a large footprint, they have an enormous system, and they need that type of capability. But that's not always going to be the case in every organization. What is true is when you're looking at that minimum bar to clear, those are the types of things that should be much easier to justify and easier to explain and ultimately easier to quantify from a cost perspective.
Thank you.
So let me just follow up a little bit on the rate-making component of this. And I know, Jonathon, you're from a wholesale market operator, so it'll be a bit of a different dynamic for you. But when we start to think about cyber investments, where utilities are able to recover cyber investments, and start thinking about, for instance, Matthew, some of the security metrics associated with cyber performance. And I think it is, I worry a little bit about opening Pandora's box from a regulator's perspective. So if I could just express my concerns out loud and just see if you have any commentary associated with this. So, typically distribution utilities protection, cyber protection of, or physical protection of their distribution system assets will be recovered in base rates, okay? And so I'm wondering how neatly and tidily the concept of applying, sort of these, security metrics, which look a lot like, almost like performance-based metrics, to that conceptually. So there's that piece that I tussle with a little bit, because I think there's definitely an element of what our EDUs are doing that is being recovered through transmission rates, I think, and then to unequivocally abide by NERC SIP standards and other standards. And then from what they said today, there's definitely an element that bleeds down into the distribution system just based upon their experience with promulgating and effectuating NERC standards. And so we're going to hear a lot about performance-based rate making tomorrow. And so I guess what I'm saying is I don't know, I really do struggle with what our role in this really needs to be. I think we need to be conscious of it. I think we need to be aware of it. But should we be scoring how the utilities are doing on distribution system security related investments? Or do you think it's enough for us to say, utility, make sure you're scoring it and you are conducting good governance and you are doing what is necessary in order to protect consumers in the footprint? Do you see the distinction there? So as opposed to us actually formally interjecting ourselves and asking for an analysis, just ensuring that an analysis is conducted. It's like kind of like the difference between, good governance and us just ensuring good governance versus us just ensuring a particular outcome. Because then I also worry that we don't know enough. And this is a constantly evolving space, and I worry that it'll be hard for government to keep pace. Is the other thing. So, anyway, that's a lot. I just randomly, downloaded to the both of you. I mean, comments on this? I'm really trying to get to the nitty-gritty of what our final sort of outcome of all of this would be.
Well, say good news is, on the metrics side of things, I don't want to imply that utilities aren't doing cybersecurity metrics. All utilities are doing some level of metrics right now. The R&D component that we're talking about is there. We think there's great value in consolidating the approach. I will tell you, many utilities have conveyed concern to me that if we get mandated to do this, we're not going to, we're going to not do this. I mean, we don't want to be mandated. There's a lot of risk, potential risk exposure of this information getting out, and that's what's been conveyed to me. We're not an advocacy organization, so to be honest with you, the rate making aspect of things quickly gets outside of my comfort zone.
And that's another can of worms is the information piece that we've got to be really cautious of, and asking the utilities to provide us with information that could be confidential. Of course, we're a public entity, so we've got public records and total transparency issues there associated with this confidential information.
Yeah. So I mean this is out. I mean, I'm a technology guy, so not a policy guy.
Tell us the regulatory answers, Matthew.
The answer is 3.
Right.
So, but I'll say there is a lot of good work going on today. The feedback we hear from utilities is we want to be proactive in addressing this issues ourselves, so we don't get regulated. To be honest with you, they don't want to be.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Regulated from that.
Well, we probably could have gleaned that ourselves.
I totally disagree.
But
everyone loves being regulated.
Yeah, right.
Everybody loves it.
I mean, so PJM, you operate the transmission system, so you've talked to us about some of the cybersecurity measures that you guys have in place, but in the end, is it you that's responsible, or is it the transmission owners that are responsible? It's transmission owners, right?
Well, so the answer is yes and no. They obviously have within their own system a lot of responsibility because they own the physical infrastructure. We are the repository and really the pass-through point for data from all of the transmission owners within our footprint. So not just the 20 transmission owner zones, but every single transmission operator plus the 1,600 generators that we have direct data linkages to so that we can dispatch those resources. So they place a great deal of trust in us to make sure that we're being good stewards of that data, and it is a lot. So I agree with you. I think they obviously have an inherent responsibility for the protection of their own systems. And
they get fined if they don't, right?
They do.
If they don't meet NERC standards, they could get could get dinged.
That's absolutely right. They have not only do they have if they're failing to meet NERC standards, they're going to get fined from that. If that results in a failure to provide the operational support that they're committed to provide, so in other words, they have a generation facility that was supposed to provide to us and they didn't, we also have an economic stick that we can hit them with for noncompliance with operation. So there are other ways to be able to approach it. But what I would say is I think the heart of your question is a very appropriate one to ask, which is I think the speed of regulation is not really compatible with the speed of change related to cybersecurity practice.
Yep.
But that's why your recommendation of you need to monitor analytics, and we're not going to be the ones that come in with a scorecard and do it, because it's really just that's not realistic for what's possible, whether it's from a monitoring or an auditing perspective to be able to go in and do that. But to be able to establish thought frameworks and what are those kind of minimum bars to clear, that's the environment that we operate in as an RTO. Is we have CIP 5 standards for cybersecurity. There are new standards around cybersecurity for supply chains. And like I said, it's regulation's not everybody's favorite thing, but what I will say is that trying to create those kind of what are the table stakes to play in this game is something that's inherently valuable to try and understand what it is that we're trying to do at a baseline, because we don't see standards at PJM as Well, that, we just get to the standard and then we just stop there. For us, all of our cyber practices are designed around going far beyond what exists as the regulatory standard that we're held to. But it doesn't mean that it isn't helpful in some ways of being able to establish that common baseline with all of those transmission owners that are in our footprint, so that we know we already have a basic understanding of how far are they right now, and how well developed are their cybersecurity programs, and what are the core practices that they're using. We know that our practices are compatible with theirs. That's helpful.
Okay, great. Please give these gentlemen a round of applause. Jonathan, Matthew, thank you very much. Really interesting day today. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. We will get into the concept of rate making in the grid modernization world. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.